We are going to cover activity-based costing in 2 videos. This one is a bit theoretical. We'll discuss ABC and why it might be used, and the method by which to implement ABC. The second video is a giant example that shows how ABC works. So let's start with an example. Sterling Cooper Ad Agency, or SC, handles 2 services for their clients, radio ads and television ads. And SC has 2 teams, R for radio and T for television, each with a service line manager and 5 staff persons. In what could only be considered an amazing coincidence, the direct labor costs and hours for each service line are identical. And here's what the physical SC office space looks like. And you can see that all the radio ads are on one side, or all the radio offices are on one side, and all the television offices are on the other side. And in the middle is a big chunk of unused space. So SC assigns overhead using direct labor hours, and overhead has only 2 components. So we're just oversimplifying it. So rent on the office and utilities on the office. So realizing that SC is underutilizing their space, management determines that the best use is to build a radio studio in the space at a cost of $200,000. So a television studio isn't practical since the space requirements and operational needs for video exceed the allowable space. And in addition, the cost of purchasing studio time should decrease over time now because the work can be done in-house. And this sounds like a good strategy. So what is the accounting result? Well, the accounting result is that overhead is going to increase by depreciation on the $200,000 build out. And let's say that over 10 years, that's about $20,000 per year. The direct materials job cost for the radio department job is going to decrease by something more than $20,000, right? So the idea is if the move to bring the studio in-house is expected to save money, then in theory, those direct material costs for the radio department should go down by something more than $20,000. So assume that direct labor hours are $500 hours per job in both radio and TV, and that total direct labor hours are $10,000. So overhead just increased by $20,000 divided by $10,000 or $2 per direct labor hour. So what happened to the profitability of radio's jobs? Well, they almost certainly went up, right? Because we know that the cost savings that they're generating should be more than the cost of putting the studio in-house. What happened to the profitability of TV's jobs? Well, without question, nothing has changed except now they're getting allocated $2 more per direct labor hour for overhead. So the question is, whose bonus went up and whose went down? So you can tell that probably radio's bonus went up and television's went down, and that's because we're using a single driver, a single cost driver, to allocate the cost of overhead. So a better way might be, as we finished off in Chapter 4, to allocate those costs on multiple drivers. Activity-based costing is such a system that does that. So we know that volume-based costing results can be distorted because indirect costs do not always occur in proportion to output volume. So for example, when we did Department A and B back in the Chapter 4 video, volume-based costing generally causes cross-subsidization of outputs, which means that some products will be overcosted, for example, television, and others undercosted, for example, radio. Activity-based costing uses detailed information about the activities that make up indirect costs, so that outputs are charged only for resources consumed by the activities needed to perform them. So in this case, there's no doubt that television is not doing any activity associated with that radio studio, and as a result, they shouldn't be charged any of those indirect costs. Okay, so we need to do a few definitions before we can dig in on ABC. So first is an activity. This is a specific task or action of work done, such as production setup. Resources are the elements needed or consumed in performing activities. Typically, we think of those as salaries or supplies. A cost driver is a cost driver or activity that is associated with either resource consumption or activity consumption. Resource consumption cost drivers measure the amount of resources consumed by an activity, And activity consumption cost drivers measure the amount of activity performed for an object. Okay. So activity-based costing uses a cost assignment approach for indirect or support costs. Resource costs such as factory overhead are assigned to activity cost pools and then to cost objects. Recall that volume-based systems assign factory overhead to a single plant or departmental cost pool first, and then to products or services using a volume-based rate, whereas ABC assigns those factory overhead costs to activities or activity cost pools using resource consumption cost drivers, and then those costs are assigned to cost objects using activity consumption cost drivers. So ABC systems differ from volume-based systems in two ways. All right, so ABC systems define cost pools as activities rather than production plant or department cost centers. So these cost drivers, ABC uses drivers based on activity or activities performed for the cost object. And of course, volume-based approaches just use a volume-based cost driver that has little or no relationship to the consumption of resources by the cost object. So there are 3 steps in the development of an ABC system. So we don't currently have an AB system. What do we need to do to put one in place? The first is you would identify resource costs and activities. So an activity analysis is performed to identify key activities and the way in which those activities consume resources. Then you're going to assign resource costs to those activities. For example, resource consumption cost drivers based on cause and effect relationship, such as the number of labor hours, the number of setups, the number of moves, the number of machine hours, the number of employees, or the square feet to assign resource costs. And then lastly, you'll assign activity costs to cost objects. So use an activity consumption cost drivers such as the number of purchase orders, the number of receiving reports, parts stored, direct labor hours, or manufacturing cycle time. You'll use these items to assign activity costs. So through activity analysis, a firm's going to identify the work it performs to carry out its operations. And it does that first by gathering data from existing documents and records, and then it collects additional data using questionnaires, observations, interviews of key personnel. So typically what you'd ask them is, well, what kind of work do you do? What do you spend your time doing? What are your activities? And how much time do you spend performing these activities? And then what resources are required to perform these activities? And then what value does the activity have for the product, service, customer, or organization? So by going through, you start to identify all the activities and the resources used for those activities. To identify resource costs for various activities, you classify all your activities according to the way in which activities consume resources. So for example, a unit level activity is performed on each individual unit of product or service. So think of that as something like direct materials. So units of production related depreciation of factory machinery, or energy costs for machinery used for individual units of production. For example, a drill press that drills holes in pieces of metal. A batch level activity is performed for each batch or group of units or products or services. So think of that as setting up machines or placing purchase orders. So machine setup costs, quality control costs, or energy costs for machinery that is used for multiple units of product at the same time. For example, an oven that bakes a batch of cookies as opposed to a single cookie, of course. A product level activity supports the production of a specific product or service. So this is something like an engineering change to modify parts. So salaries for product line purchasing managers, product development costs, and depreciation and maintenance for specialized machinery dedicated to production of a single product or service line. Facility level activities support the entire operation. So property taxes, insurance, security costs for the factory, insurance and property taxes, or the salary of a plant manager. Those are at the facility level. Okay, so once we've done that, we can assign resource cost to activities. So again, we use these resource consumption cost drivers based on cause and effect. Then we use activity consumption cost drivers to assign those costs to cost objects. Video M5A is over. The next video is an example of activity-based costing. Thanks for watching.